Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Hargrove called them when he thought they weren't listening. Hannah Clarke had heard it twice in 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial, once in the break room, once during rounds when he'd gestured dismissively at the ICU board. Just a nurse. The words landed softly, like rain on asphalt, but they were meant to sting. They didn't. Hannah had stopped feeling most things the moment she took off her uniform and folded it into a storage locker in a place no one here would ever understand. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as she arrived at 5:47 in the morning, 16 minutes before her shift officially began. Habit. The kind of habit you developed when timeliness wasn't a preference but a survival mechanism. Her badge clattered against her sternum as she pushed through the ICU doors, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and human suffering wrapped around her like a second skin. 3 years of this place. 3 years of keeping her head down, checking vitals with mechanical precision, eating lunch in her car where no one could see her hands shake. 3 years of being invisible. Which was exactly how she wanted it. Hannah moved through the pre-dawn darkness of Oak Creek Memorial like someone passing through water, present but not displacing anything, necessary but not remarkable. The ICU sprawled across the third floor's east wing, 12 beds arranged in a semicircle of monitored vigilance. She knew every cable, every alarm threshold, every patient name by memory. She'd spent the last 72 hours with Mr. Patterson in bed for, a 68-year-old diabetic with sepsis that was losing its war against antibiotics. She knew the rhythm of his breathing, the pattern of his pain, the way his daughter visited at exactly 2 o'clock every afternoon with flowers that he couldn't see anymore because the morphine had taken most of his world. That was the work. That was all the work needed to be. Her locker was in the back corner of the staff room, wedged between a fire extinguisher and a cabinet of outdated CPR manuals. She changed into her scrubs, navy blue, unremarkable, the kind of uniform designed to make you blend into any hospital in America. As she hung her jacket inside, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining caught the overhead light for a moment. Sangin coordinates embroidered in thread that had faded from black to grey over 8 years. She turned it inward. The door clicked shut. The morning rounds began at 6:15, and Hannah positioned herself at the medication cart with the calculated invisibility of someone who'd learned to occupy space without being seen. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 6:23, his white coat pressed so sharply it could cut, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal he'd awarded himself. He was 44, Hannah had learned from the hospital directory, with 2 ex-wives and a daughter at Duke who'd gotten into medical school on the first try, a fact he mentioned at least once per week. His power was the kind that came from connections rather than competence, from board memberships and country club lunches and a brother-in-law who was a state senator. He moved through the hospital like he owned the floorboards. "Morning report," he said, not to anyone in particular but to the room itself, which jumped to attention. 3 residents, 2 nurses, a respiratory therapist. They gathered like students summoned by an invisible bell. Hannah remained at the medication cart, organizing chest decompression needles with unusual precision, the kind of precision that made no sense to civilian protocol but felt necessary to her hands. "Patterson in for is transitioning to comfort measures," she heard herself say. The words came out soft, deferential, the voice she wore like a mask. "Daughter wants the afternoon visit to be the last aggressive intervention." Hargrove nodded without looking at her. Just a nurse reporting data. Just someone reading numbers off a screen. He moved to the next bed, and the group moved with him like a school of fish responding to a single predator's change of direction. The waiting room filled with the regular morning traffic, families arriving with coffee and dread, patients being prepped for procedures, the endless machinery of a hospital doing what hospitals do. Hannah moved through it all with the same practiced efficiency, her hands steady now, her face a mask of professional composure. Her forearms were covered, as always, despite the July heat that pressed against the windows like something alive. Long sleeves. They'd commented on it once, back in April, when the hospital had implemented Casual Friday for summer staff. "You must get hot," one of the younger nurses had said, not unkindly. Hannah had smiled without showing her teeth and continued wearing long sleeves. The unit was quiet when the ambulance bay radio crackled at 7:58. Oak Creek Memorial, this is County EMS responding with a Navy transport. Single patient, Category 1, 37-year-old male, shrapnel wound sustained during a training exercise. ETA 12 minutes. The words came through the speaker in that clipped, professional tone that emergency personnel use to keep emotion out of crisis. But Hannah heard something else underneath, the hesitation, the unusual detail about the Navy, the specificity of a training exercise that sounded like something else entirely. She didn't move. She didn't react. The other nurses were already mobilizing, pulling trauma kits, alerting Hargrove, preparing the resuscitation bay. Standard protocol. Standard response to standard catastrophe. Trauma bay 2, she heard herself say. Her voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's throat. Full monitoring. Call type and cross for 8 units. One of the younger nurses, a resident named Chen, looked at her with brief surprise. Hannah rarely gave orders. Hannah rarely did anything except what she was explicitly asked to do. But the words had come out with the weight of someone who'd said them before, in different circumstances, in places where hesitation meant corpses and failure meant notification letters to mothers who were about to lose their sons. She was moving toward the supply room when the ambulance bay doors slid open, and the world compressed into a single point of impossible clarity. The stretcher came through at speed, the paramedic calling vitals in that same clipped voice, penetrating shrapnel injuries to right chest wall, multiple lacerations, field dressings applied at scene, patient was conscious and alert, vitals en route. But Hannah wasn't listening to the paramedic. She was staring at the patient's face. 37 years old, the radio had said. Built like someone who understood what discipline meant. Eyes closed, but the bone structure underneath was a map she'd memorized 8 years ago, in a place that still existed in her dreams. Captain Marcus Reeves. Not just any captain. Not just any Navy officer. Her son's commanding officer from Sangin. The man who'd called her house on a Tuesday in 2016 to tell her that Lieutenant Jake Clarke had been hit by an IED but was going to make it, and that Captain Reeves himself would personally ensure her boy came home alive. That had been his exact promise, made in a voice that carried the weight of oath. The medication card she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and hit the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot. Bottles scattered across the floor, rolling in different directions, the noise sudden and wrong in the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. No one was looking at her except one person. Dr. Hargrove stood at the edge of the resuscitation area, his eyes sharp and cold and absolutely focused on Hannah's face in a way that made the back of her neck go rigid. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds. Watched her hands, which had stopped shaking the moment she'd heard the captain's vitals but had now begun to move with automatic purpose toward the trauma bay. Watched her approach the stretcher. Watched her eyes, for just a fraction of a second, lock onto Captain Reeves' face with recognition that went deeper than any hospital record could document. Then he smiled. The captain's shirt was cut away by the paramedics as they transferred him to the trauma bed, and Hannah could see the damage, shrapnel lacerations across the right chest wall, bleeding controlled but not stopped, the kind of wound that meant someone had understood field medicine well enough to know what pressure applied where might mean the difference between breathing and not breathing. She reached for his wrist, checking the radial pulse with fingers that moved like they were reading a language only her body understood. His skin was cold. Blood loss. Hypovolemia. The numbers calculated themselves inside her skull without her having to speak them aloud. Pulse is thready, she said, still soft, still deferential, still just a nurse reading data. Breathing is shallow. Possible pneumothorax on the right side. Listen to his breath sounds. Dr. Hargrove was already moving toward the captain, the team around him moving with practiced efficiency. He placed his stethoscope against the captain's chest, his face reflecting nothing, his movements precise. A competent doctor. That was the thing about Hargrove, he was competent. He just wasn't good. There was a difference that most people never bothered learning. Breath sounds diminished right side, Hargrove said. He looked at Hannah. The smile had faded, but something else had taken its place, a kind of territorial awareness, a dog recognizing another dog in his yard and deciding whether to fight or establish dominance. Oxygen saturation 87. Let's get a chest X-ray and prep for possible tube placement. 2 large bore 4s, type and cross for 6 units. The team dispersed. The work continued. And Hannah stood at the captain's shoulder, her hand resting on the stretcher rail, her eyes tracking his vital signs on the monitor with the kind of focus that made you invisible because no one could imagine that anything you were doing mattered more than what the doctors were doing. But she was checking his pupils. Noting the slight deviation in his left eye that meant increased intracranial pressure. Observing the way his chest wall moved asymmetrically, favoring the left side, suggesting that the right lung was already compromised. These were things she shouldn't have noticed. These were things that only someone with specific training, the kind of training that wasn't listed on a civilian nursing license, would think to check. Hargrove glanced at her again as the captain was wheeled toward imaging. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he's decided he doesn't understand yet but definitely intends to investigate. His hand was already moving toward his phone, his fingers pulling up his notes app, his mind already working through whatever equation had made him interested in why a floor nurse had reacted to a Navy officer like she was greeting a ghost. The door to the imaging suite closed, and Hannah was left standing in the trauma bay with instruments scattered on the counter and the faint smell of iodine and human blood mixing with the antiseptic that never quite masked anything. She looked down at her hands. They were absolutely steady now. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer, and somewhere in the distance, a monitor began to alarm for a different patient, in a different tragedy, in a different life that didn't require Hannah Clarke to pretend she was someone she'd spent 3 years trying to become. But that pretense was already beginning to crack. The crack in Hannah's composure was invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look for it. That single tear had been a mistake, a physical betrayal of the 3 years she'd spent training her body to absorb punishment without flinching. She'd corrected it immediately, wiped it away with the back of her hand before Hargrove could use it as evidence, but the damage was already done. Mrs. Reeves had seen it. The captain had seen it from his hospital bed, his broken body propped at a 45-degree angle, his eyes tracking Hannah's face with the recognition of someone who understood what quiet composure cost. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway of Captain Reeves's room, his white coat crisp as a military dress uniform, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who'd never once been questioned by anyone who could hurt him back. "Nurse Clarke, perhaps you'd like to explain to our patient's family why you believe you're qualified to recommend surgical specialists." His words were measured, designed to land in front of witnesses. "Last I checked, your job description involves bedpans, not treatment plans." Hannah had heard variations of this message her entire career: you are not a doctor, you are not an expert, you are not allowed to think, you are only permitted to follow. But this time was different. This time she could see the shrapnel pattern in Captain Reeves's left flank, the way the wounds tracked upward and inward in a ballistic signature she recognized from Sangin, from sand and blood and a medic's training that never truly left your hands no matter how many years you spent pretending it had. The captain needed Dr. Chen, the trauma surgeon who specialized in blast injuries, who understood the physics of how explosive force traveled through human tissue, who knew that standard surgical protocols meant nothing when you were treating a man who'd survived an IED 3,000 miles away. She'd taken one measured breath before answering. "Captain Reeves deserves someone who understands what happened to him," she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Then she excused herself, moving past Hargrove with her spine straight, her hand steady at her sides, every muscle controlled. That was the thing about military training, it taught you how to appear unshattered even as you fractured from the inside. The break room was a sanctuary of fluorescent lighting and beige walls, a place where nurses shed their professional armor for 30 minutes and became human again. Hannah pushed through the door at 1:15 p.m. with her lunch, a protein bar and black coffee, the same meal she'd eaten alone for 3 years. She sat at the corner table by the window that overlooked the parking lot, the sun streaming across her hands in harsh geometric patterns. 3 nurses entered at 1:18. She recognized them immediately: Rodriguez, Kim, and Justine, all solid ICU staff, all people she'd worked 12-hour shifts with without incident. They saw her. She watched their eyes register her presence, watched the micro-expressions flicker across their faces like warning lights on a dashboard: recognition, hesitation, calculation. The breaking point came when Justine glanced at Rodriguez and they exchanged a look that was older than language, a look that meant we heard what happened, we know you're radioactive now, we can't afford to be standing near you when Hargrove decides to clean house. Oh, I just remembered I need to check on Mrs. Patterson's foresight, Rodriguez said to no one in particular, already moving toward the door. And I promised I'd grab supplies, Justine added, her voice pitched to sound urgent and believable. Kim lingered for a moment longer, long enough to open her lunch container, long enough to look like she might stay. Then she seemed to think better of it. Forgot my yogurt in my locker, she murmured, and followed the others out. The silence that remained was the particular emptiness of a room that had held people seconds before. Hannah could hear the hum of the vending machine in the corner, the distant beeping of monitors from the ICU 2 corridors away, the ambient sound of hospital machinery that never truly stopped. She could hear her own breathing. She unwrapped the protein bar and ate it slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to consume rations in forward operating bases where meals were fuel and nothing more. By the time she finished, she'd categorized what had just happened: social ostracism, calculated isolation, the institutional machinery of professional self-protection already spinning into place. The written warning appeared on the unit board at 3:27 p.m., typed on official Oak Creek Memorial letterhead, posted where every staff member on the ICU rotation would see it. Hannah read it once, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, her eyes tracking each word with the precision of someone reading a combat order. Official reprimand, Nurse H. Clarke. Date, today. Reason for action, insubordination and unauthorized medical recommendations. Details: Nurse Clarke overstepped her scope of practice by recommending specific surgical personnel to attending physicians, undermining physician authority and disrupting hospital hierarchy. Continued violations will result in immediate termination. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Medicine. 2 junior doctors whispered nearby, their voices pitched low but not low enough. Hannah could feel their attention like crosshairs. She read the warning one more time, committing every word to memory the way she'd committed navigation routes and radio frequencies and the names of 43 Marines she'd lost in a single afternoon in Helmand Province. Then she walked away, her movements controlled, her face empty, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. Hargrove watched her from his office window, his fingers already moving across his phone screen. He had made the first call by 5 p.m. to Board Chairman Mitchell, who golfed with him every third Saturday and owed him professional favors. "We have a problematic staff member," Hargrove had said, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of an administrator protecting institutional standards. Undermining physician authority, making medical recommendations beyond her scope, creating a culture of insubordination that affects the entire unit. "I need your support for immediate removal proceedings." Mitchell had agreed. Of course he agreed. This was how the system worked, a call from one connected man to another, a promise of institutional backing, the machinery of professional destruction operating exactly as designed. The second call went to Board Vice Chairman Henderson, framed slightly differently. "I'm concerned about liability," Hargrove said. "A nurse making unauthorized surgical recommendations could expose us to malpractice claims. We need to document her history of overreach before something serious happens." By 6:15 p.m., Hargrove had placed a third call to St. Augustine's University, Hannah's nursing school, requesting her complete academic record and contact information for her original references. He was methodical about it, building a case the way a prosecutor builds a wall, one brick at a time, each one carefully placed, pressure mounting incrementally. Hannah finished her shift at 7 p.m. and clocked out without looking at the unit board again. She didn't need to. The message had already been received and filed into the part of her brain that processed threats and calculated survival percentages. 12 hours ago she had simply been a nurse. Now she was a problem. Now she was someone the hospital had decided to discard. It was a progression she recognized from somewhere deep in her past, a familiar pattern of institutional pressure designed to isolate and eliminate. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Captain Reeves was deteriorating in his hospital bed 2 corridors away, his body's internal chemistry already beginning its descent toward cascade failure. His oxygen saturation was dropping incrementally every hour. His left lung was slowly filling with fluid. The shrapnel fragments embedded in his chest cavity were migrating microscopically with each breath, each one a potential needle moving toward vital structures. The mass casualty event that would hit the ER in less than 13 hours was already being called into 911 by drivers on Interstate 40, their voices frantic through the radio static, their descriptions of mangled metal and crushed bodies, the first warning that the hospital was about to lose all its attending physicians to the emergency department, leaving Captain Reeves in the ICU with nothing but a nurse and a prayer. But that nightmare was still hours away. For now, Hannah drove home through the Raleigh evening traffic, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her military composure perfectly maintained even as something fundamental shifted in the architecture of her life. The life she'd built, quiet, invisible, deliberately small, had just become impossible to maintain. Dr. Hargrove had made sure of that. He'd drawn a line, posted it publicly, and forced her to choose between staying silent or standing up. And standing up, she was learning, meant standing alone. 18 hours had passed since Captain Reeves arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with shrapnel wounds that should have killed him twice over. Hannah monitored his vitals every 4 hours during her shifts, watching the subtle changes that nobody else seemed to notice. The way his breathing had shifted, shallower on the left side, favoring his right. The slight tension in his neck when he tried to turn. Small things. The kind of things a combat medic learns to read the way other people read facial expressions. By midnight on the second night, she knew something was wrong. Hannah stood at his bedside during the quiet hours when the hospital exhaled, when the chaos of daytime rounds dissolved into the low hum of machines and the occasional nurse walking corridors that felt longer after dark. Captain Reeves slept fitfully, his chest rising and falling with effort she could see from 3 feet away. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, pulse rapid, thready. She placed her hand flat against his left ribs and felt the difference immediately. The resistance. The way air wasn't moving where it should. A tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself with screaming. It whispers. It builds. And by the time the body can't hide it anymore, there are maybe minutes left. Hannah made the calls at 1:27 a.m. Dr. Patterson was in surgery, scrubbed in, unavailable. Dr. Chen wasn't answering his page. Dr. Morrison said he was sleeping and couldn't respond to non-emergencies. The resident on call, Dr. Phillips, picked up on the 4th ring and listened to Hannah's assessment with a silence that felt like a closed door. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he finally said. But 20 minutes was a luxury her patient didn't have. Hannah could feel it in the way the captain's oxygen saturation was beginning to drift. 88%. 87%. The slow slide that meant his lung was collapsing. She called again. This time she reached the operator and asked for the attending physicians on rotation, all of them. 12 names came back as either in surgery, unreachable, or blocked per Dr. Hargrove's directive labeling non-priority cases as unable to interrupt attending staff during rest hours. Not her words. The operator's words. Hargrove's words, filtered through hospital policy, weaponized against the man dying in front of her. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent. Hannah stood alone at 2:04 a.m. No doctors. No backup. No one coming. Just her and a Navy officer whose wife had fallen asleep in the waiting room, whose commanding officer had trusted him to survive, whose son's life intersected with hers in ways that couldn't be explained to anyone in this hospital without destroying what little remained of her invisibility. Captain Reeves's eyes opened. His hand reached for hers. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "I know," Hannah said. His oxygen saturation was 79% and falling. His breathing had become labored, desperate. His skin was taking on the pale cast of someone whose blood wasn't getting enough oxygen, whose body was beginning to shut down. Hannah felt the fear rise in her chest like floodwater, felt it grip her throat, make her hands tremble as she reached for his wrist to check his pulse one more time. Then something shifted. It wasn't gradual. It was like a switch flipping inside her chest. The fear burned away. The trembling stopped. Her hands went absolutely still. She wasn't standing in a clean American hospital anymore. She was in Sangin, in a compound blown open by an RPG, dust in her eyes, sun grinding between her teeth, a SEAL officer with half his chest torn open gasping her name. She could smell the copper and cordite. She could hear the round snapping through the wall. She could feel the weight of his body against hers as she performed this exact procedure while Marines screamed and dust fell like snow. Her hands knew what to do. She moved to the supply cart with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been written in blood and training. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was exactly where it should be. Chest decompression kit. Antiseptic swabs. She had prepped this equipment 1,000 times in 1,000 moments of controlled panic. Captain Reeves lay back against the pillows, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't ask what she was doing. He knew. Somehow, in the way soldiers always know when someone who's seen combat is about to save their life, he simply surrendered to her hands. Hannah counted the ribs. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She ran the antiseptic swab across the site in 4 seconds, no hesitation, no wasted motion. Her fingers found the space between his ribs with absolute precision. The needle went in smooth and sure. There was a hiss. The sound of trapped air escaping, of pressure releasing, of lungs beginning to re-inflate. The captain gasped, his body rigid for a single moment, and then he was breathing. Actually breathing. His oxygen saturation began its climb. 78%. 82%. 85%. 89%. His color returned first to his lips, then to his cheeks. His hand gripped Hannah's wrist with the force of a man pulling himself back from the edge. She monitored him for the next hour, documenting every vital sign change with the clinical precision that Navy Corpsman protocol demanded. Heart rate stabilizing. Breathing deepening. Color returning. By 3:15 a.m., Captain Reeves was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of a man whose body had stopped fighting for survival and started healing. Hannah sat in the chair beside his bed. Her hands finally trembled now, but only as the adrenaline faded. Only as the reality of what she'd just done, what she'd admitted by doing it, began to settle into her bones like radiation sinking deep. She had practiced medicine without a license. She had overstepped protocol in the most fundamental way possible. She had revealed, to Captain Reeves's conscious mind and to the medical record she'd just written into the hospital system, that she was something far more than a bedside nurse following orders. But the captain was alive. That was the only thing that mattered. At 6:16 a.m., Dr. Hargrove arrived for early rounds, his coffee still steaming, his expression serene. He reviewed Captain Reeves's chart at the nursing station, his eyes moving across the page with the speed of someone who didn't expect to see anything remarkable. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. His fingers tightened around the tablet. He read the note again. Emergency needle decompression performed at 020 hours per Senior Chief Protocol. Hannah watched his face darken from across the unit. She watched him set the tablet down carefully, deliberately, the way someone sets down something that might shatter. She watched him pull out his phone. The first call took 3 minutes. The second call, 2. By 6:44 a.m., he was off the phone, his expression carrying the satisfied calculation of someone who'd just set something irreversible in motion. Hospital security arrived at 6:02 a.m. Morrison, the chief of security, had the uncomfortable look of a man who'd been told to execute an order he didn't fully understand. With him came board members Mitchell and Hawthorne, both dressed in the kind of business casual that signaled this was official. Both carrying the weight of institutional authority that made even other doctors step back. Hargrove stood at the center of the nursing station where staff members pretended not to listen. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nurse Clarke, you are suspended effective immediately for practicing medicine without a license," he said. "Security will escort you from the building. A formal investigation into your credentials begins this morning, and I personally intend to ensure your termination." Hannah set down her pen. She removed her badge from her neck with deliberate calm and handed it to Morrison. Her hands were steady now. Her face was composed. She would not give Hargrove the satisfaction of seeing her break, not even now, not even as everything she built to hide was collapsing. "I understand," she said. Her voice was quiet. Respectful. A nurse accepting her punishment. She turned to look at Captain Reeves through the glass wall of his ICU room. He was awake. His eyes met hers with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and why. He was alive because she'd stopped being invisible. And now she was gone because the truth couldn't stay hidden. Morrison gestured toward the elevator. Hannah grabbed her jacket from her locker, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, hidden where no one would ever see it. She walked toward the exit with her spine straight and her shoulders back. Behind her, she could feel Hargrove watching. She could feel the weight of his satisfaction pressing against her back like a physical force. She didn't look back. Not once. The doors burst open at 6 in the morning. Dr. Hargrove stride into the ICU flanked by 2 board members in pressed suits and 3 security officers whose radios crackled with static. His face carried the expression of a man who'd spent the night making phone calls and had every intention of finishing what he'd started. Hannah was checking Captain Reeves's vitals when she heard the footsteps, too many, too coordinated, moving with institutional authority. She didn't turn around. She already knew. "Ms. Clarke." Hargrove's voice echoed across the unit. Not a question. A summons. The other nurses pretended not to notice. They suddenly became very interested in medication carts and supply cabinets. Captain Reeves's wife gripped the bed rail, confused. Hannah turned slowly, her hands releasing the blood pressure cuff with deliberate care. One measured breath. Her eyes met Hargrove's and held there, no fear, no anger, just a flat stare like looking at someone through reinforced glass. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your credentials and your conduct." Hargrove's words arrived like documents being filed. "You performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Without physician oversight. Without a license to do so." The board members nodded in synchronized agreement, their disapproval forming a wall of institutional weight. "Our legal counsel has advised us that you may be liable for practicing medicine without a license. The North Carolina Board of Nursing has been notified. Your employment here is terminated pending the outcome of their investigation." Hannah said nothing. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly, though her molars pressed together hard enough to hurt. She'd been trained for this, not this exact scenario, but the principle: you take the hit without flinching. You give them nothing to use as leverage. "I've already contacted your nursing school references," Hargrove continued, his voice carrying the precise edge of someone who'd done his homework. "Clinical supervisors from your program. We're reviewing your entire employment history. If there are any discrepancies in your credentials, if you misrepresented your qualifications on your application to Oak Creek Memorial, that will result in formal charges." He paused, letting that sink in like a stone in still water. "Security will escort you from the premises." One of the board members added, "You are not to return to this unit or contact any staff member regarding this matter. Any communication will be interpreted as harassment." The security officers stepped forward. One of them was a young man named Derek who'd always smiled at Hannah in the break room. He wasn't smiling now. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I need to retrieve my personal items," Hannah said. Her voice was level. Conversational, almost. Like she was asking about the weather. "We'll provide a box," Hargrove said. "You'll be escorted to your locker, you'll collect only personal items, and you'll leave the premises. It needs to be quick." It needed to be quick. Hannah understood. 7:00 a.m. was shift change. The hallways would be crowded. Maximum visibility. Maximum impact. The new day shift arriving would see her being walked out, badge gone, papers in hand. The message would spread through Oak Creek Memorial like someone had announced it on the intercom. Captain Reeves tried to speak. "Doctor, wait, this nurse, she..." That's not your concern, Captain, Hargrove said without looking at him. Ms. Clarke, let's move. The walk to her locker took 4 minutes. It felt like 40. Hannah's locker was in the break room, down the main corridor of the ICU, then left through the double doors that opened onto the central hallway that connected all 4 patient units. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their constant electric hum. Her scrubs were still damp with sweat from the emergency, still carrying the faint metallic scent of blood that hadn't fully washed out. The security officers flanked her, not touching, but close enough that it was clear she wasn't choosing to leave. Nurses emerged from patient rooms. Doctors paused mid-conversation. A resident from surgery made eye contact with Hannah and quickly looked away, his jaw tight. An ICU attending she'd worked with for 2 years stepped back into a doorway like she might be contagious. The message was simple: don't be next. Hannah's locker was at the far end of the break room. Someone had left a half-full coffee mug on the counter. Someone else's lunch sat untouched in the refrigerator, probably forgotten days ago. She opened her locker. Inside, a spare stethoscope, a package of gum, a photograph of her and Jake from 5 years ago when he was 21, grinning in his dress blues. Her hands moved slowly. She didn't rush. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her scramble. The box filled quickly. Stethoscope. Photo. The small wooden compass Jake had given her as a joke 2 years ago, so you can always find your way home, Mom. She'd never told him that she was already lost. She placed the compass in the box with care, like it might break. Derek stood in the doorway, uncomfortable, his radio quiet at his hip. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what it's worth." Hannah looked at him. Really looked at him. "It's fine," she said. "You're doing your job." When she turned around, Hargrove was standing in the break room doorway with the 2 board members behind him. He looked satisfied. The kind of satisfaction a man gets when he's successfully removed a problem from the equation. His phone sat in his pocket, already loaded with the names and numbers of her nursing school references. He'd spent the night building his case, brick by brick, making sure there were no loose threads, no way for her to claim she was being persecuted without cause. The walk back through the hallway was slower. A stretcher passed them going the opposite direction. An orderly steering it glanced at Hannah and then away. The elevator doors opened. The elevator closed. Security walked her through the main hospital lobby at 7:23 a.m., right when the morning shift was changing, when the lobby was crowded with people arriving to start their 12 hours. Doctors in white coats. Nurses carrying water bottles. Therapists heading to the physical medicine wing. All of them saw her walk past in her scrubs with security flanking her and a box in her arms. All of them would hear the story before 8 a.m. The nurse who'd overstepped. The nurse who'd broken protocol. The nurse who'd been removed. The parking lot air was cool. Late October, still weeks before winter but the season already shifting. Hannah unlocked her car, a 7-year-old Subaru that smelled like coffee and the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and placed the box in the passenger seat with the same careful precision she'd used for the compass. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel for 20 minutes, every muscle in her body locked tight, breathing slowly in through her nose and out through her mouth. In and out. In and out. The way she'd been trained. The way you survived things that were supposed to kill you. The drive home was automatic. Hannah drove on Route 64 without really seeing it, through Raleigh's morning traffic, past the pharmacy where she sometimes picked up prescriptions, past the grocery store where she shopped on Sunday mornings. The radio played quietly, something about the weather, something about election results, and she didn't change the station. The drive took 23 minutes. Her house was a small 1-story colonial on Maple Street, pale blue with white trim, a front porch where she never Saturday. She'd bought it 3 years ago with cash from her separation settlement, the money the Navy had given her when she'd walked away with medical discharge paperwork and a folder full of commendations she'd never shown to anyone. She parked in the driveway. Didn't go inside immediately. Sat there in the car in her scrubs, the box still in the passenger seat, the weight of 3 years suddenly collapsing into a single moment. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of being just a nurse at a hospital where no one asked questions and no one knew that she'd held a perimeter for 6 hours in Sangin while mortars hit the compound 60 meters away. 3 years of nightmares she never discussed, of a PTSD service dog she'd sent back to the program because she couldn't bear explaining why she needed it, of silence that had seemed so protective and now felt like quicksand. She finally went inside. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, coffee mug in the sink from yesterday morning, a pile of mail on the counter she hadn't opened, the table with 4 chairs that she only ever used one of. She sat down at the table in her scrubs, still damp and carrying that metallic scent, and she put her hands over her face. The sound that came out was barely a sound at all, no wailing, no dramatic collapse, just the kind of sobbing that comes from someplace beneath words, from the place where you finally admit that you can't keep running from what you are. Her shoulders shook. Tears ran down the backs of her hands. She'd saved a man's life. She'd done exactly what she was trained to do, what she was born to do, and it had destroyed everything she'd built. 3 years. 36 months of careful construction of walls and silence and the fiction that she was someone who belonged in a hospital pushing medications and checking monitors, someone ordinary, someone safe. The front door opened at 10:37 a.m. Jake had his own key, used it on Tuesday mornings when he came by for breakfast before his shift at the woodworking shop where he built custom furniture. He found his mother at the kitchen table, still in her scrubs, her face blotchy from crying, staring at nothing. "Mom." His voice changed immediately from cheerful to alarmed. Jake was 26, a former Marine corporal with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's dark eyes. He'd served with Captain Marcus Reeves in Sangin. They'd lost men in the same firefight on June 14, 2013. Jake didn't know his mother had been there too. "Why are you home? Why are you in scrubs? Did something happen at the hospital?" Hannah couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. She shook her head very slightly, the only answer she could manage. Jake sat down across from her, his coffee shop breakfast sandwich forgotten in his hand. "Mom, talk to me. Please." "What happened?" "I was fired," Hannah said. Her voice sounded like someone else's. Like it was coming from somewhere very far away. "This morning." "What? Why?" "You've worked there for 3 years with no problems." She shook her head again. She couldn't explain. Couldn't tell him that she'd saved the man who'd kept him alive in hell. Couldn't tell him that she'd been in Sangin too, 2011 to 2014, 3 tours, same dust, same screaming, same weight of bodies that never really lifted. Couldn't tell him that his commanding officer, the man he'd credited with saving his life, was currently in that hospital bed because of her. Couldn't tell him any of it because saying it would mean explaining why she'd lied to him for 26 years, why she'd never told him she was Navy too, why she'd let him believe she was just a civilian mother who'd worried about him from a distance while he was deployed. Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "Mom, you're scaring me. Talk to me." Hannah stared at their hands on the table, his calloused from years of woodworking, hers calloused from 4 lines and sutures and needle decompression performed in a compound in Afghanistan while people were dying around her. At Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove was making calls. He'd already contacted the North Carolina Board of Nursing. Now he was reaching out to Hannah's clinical supervisors from her nursing program at UNC, explaining the situation, requesting any documentation that might show she'd misrepresented her experience or her qualifications during the hiring process. He was methodical. He was careful. He was convinced that he'd done the right thing by removing a problem before it metastasized into something worse. He did not know that at that exact moment, in a naval administrative office in Washington, D.C., someone was reading an incident report about a Navy captain who'd been saved by emergency needle decompression at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh by a nurse named Hannah Clarke. He did not know that this person was picking up a phone and calling someone else's phone. He did not know that wheels were beginning to turn, the slow, massive machinery of the Department of Defense, the Navy personnel system, the SEAL command chain, wheels that moved with the inevitability of gravity and that he could not see and could not stop. 2 hours after Hannah's suspension, her son Jake found her at the kitchen table with her scrubs still on, coffee gone cold in the mug, her hands folded like someone had taught them not to move. He didn't ask questions. He could see the answer in the way her shoulders curved inward, the kind of posture that belonged to someone carrying weight that shouldn't fit through doorways. He went to her bedroom closet to find a sweatshirt, something to wrap around her, and the closet door swung open with the force of a hinge that had been waiting 18 years to break. A faded jacket tumbled from the top shelf, not hers, he thought at first. Military green, old enough to have weathered 3 decades of storage. He caught it before it hit the floor and felt the weight of it, the particular heaviness of wool that had absorbed rain on continents he'd only read about. His fingers found the seam along the inside lining, and there, sewn with the precision of someone who'd learned to repair things in sandstorms and darkness, was a unit patch. Not a civilian hospital patch. Not a Red Cross symbol. A Navy patch, faded to the color of old photographs, embroidered with an anchor and the designation that took his breath away. Jake walked back to the kitchen table with the jacket hanging from his outstretched hands. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway between rooms and whispered the words like a question, like an accusation, like a prayer. "Mom, you're a senior chief." Hannah's head came up so slowly it was as if she was pulling herself out of deep water. Her eyes found the patch in his hands and everything in her face went absolutely still, the kind of still that comes from learning your whole life just split into before and after. She didn't reach for the jacket. She didn't speak. She met his eyes and held them, and in that moment Jake understood that the nightmares he'd heard through her bedroom wall, the names she whispered in her sleep, the way she could read his moods like a tactical map, none of it was accident. All of it was experience. All of it was Sangin. The moment stretched like taffy. Then his phone buzzed. Then hers. Then both of them again, rapid fire, messages cascading across their screens. He looked at the notifications and felt something in his chest hollow out. Navy liaison. Incoming transport. Raleigh Durham Airfield. ETA 22 minutes. Not a request. Not information. A notification of something already in motion, wheels already turning. 36 hours after the hospital had escorted her from the building, the sound of rotor blades descended over Oak Creek Memorial like a thunderstorm arriving early. The UH-60M Black Hawk didn't land in the parking lot, it landed on the hospital helipad, because the military doesn't ask permission when they're retrieving one of their own. The rotor wash shook the windows in the ICU. Every monitor alarm went off simultaneously, and for a moment the unit was chaos, until the nurses realized the helicopter wasn't a medical emergency. It was a delivery. 2 Navy officers in dress blues walked through the ICU doors like men who didn't know the meaning of hesitation. The second one carried a folder that was stamped 3 times with classification markings that had no civilian equivalent. They didn't ask for the nurse station. They didn't check with charge. They walked directly to the charge nurse and said only one name, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Where? The room went dead silent. The monitors continued their mechanical rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their patient breath. But every person within earshot had stopped moving, because nobody introduces themselves that way unless the person they're looking for has credentials that live in a different universe entirely. Hannah was on her 3rd cup of coffee at home, staring at nothing through a window that looked like it was painted shut, when her phone rang with a number she'd deleted years ago but still knew by heart. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Marcus Reeves, calling from his hospital bed 3 miles away, his voice rough with medication and something else, urgency. "They're here," he said. 2 officers. "They're asking for you by rank. Your actual rank." "Hannah, they know." She hung up the phone without answering, because there was nothing to answer. She'd already known they would come. The question had always been when, not if. She changed into the clothes she'd worn yesterday, the clothes they'd made her change out of when they suspended her, and drove back to Oak Creek Memorial like she was pulling a trigger she couldn't unload. The Navy officers were in the ICU when she arrived. They saw her before anyone else did, the way that military men see military women, a recognition that happens in the nervous system, not the conscious mind. One of them nodded. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. Senior Chief. It wasn't a question. Dr. Hargrove was there. That was the thing nobody had planned but everyone had anticipated. He was standing at the foot of Captain Reeves's bed when Hannah walked in, his face the color of old news, because he'd spent the last 36 hours watching the military apparatus arrive at his hospital like a freighter docking at a pier. Captain Reeves was propped up on pillows, still fragile, still tethered to monitors and 4 lines, but his eyes were clear and they were locked on Hargrove with the intensity of a man who'd just survived something his doctor had abandoned him to face alone. In Reeves's trembling hands was a folder, the same folder one of the officers had carried. He opened it with the deliberation of someone defusing a bomb. The first page was a service record. His voice came out hoarse but steady as he read aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Margaret Clarke. 3 tours. Sangin Valley, Helm and Province. Bagram Airfield. FOB Shank. His eyes found hers. 837 combat casualties treated in field conditions. 34 lives saved with emergency protocols. He flipped the page. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum like insects trapped in glass. Commendation for Valor. His fingers shook as he turned another page. 2 Navy Crosses. Hargrove's face had gone from white to grey, the color of cement, the color of surrender. That's... He started, but the next voice cut him off like a door slamming. The SEAL commander who'd flown in on the helicopter stood at the ICU entrance. He had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, shoulders like load-bearing walls, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, and a voice that came from somewhere deeper than the throat. He stepped forward and every person in the ICU felt the shift, the way a room recognizes that authority has just walked through the door. Senior Chief Clarke, he said, and the way he said her rank meant something entirely different from the way Hargrove had said just a nurse. The commander looked at the gathered staff, our nurses, residents, respiratory therapists, all of them frozen like animals when a predator appears. He began to speak, and his voice carried the weight of documentation, Bronze Star for Initiative Under Fire. Purple Heart, April 2009. Another Purple Heart, September 2010. He paused between each decoration like a judge reading a sentence. Silver Star for Extraordinary Heroism during the Sangin Ambush, 2011. And a Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor, for coordinating the emergency medevac of an entire SEAL Team 3 element after their medical officer was killed. The commander's eyes found Hannah. You were 24 years old. You had 1 radio, no backup, and enemy combatants within 200 meters. You kept all 6 men alive until the Black Hawk extracted them. He turned to face the entire ICU. And 36 hours ago, when 12 attending physicians refused or were unavailable to treat a Navy captain in acute distress, Senior Chief Clarke performed emergency needle decompression using the same protocols that saved lives in Sangin. She used muscle memory earned over 3 tours, under fire, with far fewer resources than she had access to in this hospital. His voice cut through the gathered crowd of staff like a blade. She saved his life. And you suspended her. Hargrove's face had drained of all color, not just white now, but the color of a man watching his entire architecture collapse. He turned to leave, but the officer stepped sideways and blocked the exit with the simple geometry of a man who'd learned to occupy space in ways that couldn't be moved. The hospital's IT director stepped forward before Hargrove could reach the door. His name was Marcus Webb and he wore his Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm like a letter of introduction. 2 tours in Fallujah. He handed a flash drive to the hospital president with the precision of someone delivering evidence at a war crimes tribunal. Dr. Voss, he said, at 9:17 a.m. this morning, Dr. Hargrove accessed the security system administrative panel and attempted to delete footage from ICU camera 3, timestamped 0200 to 0300 hours. The footage of Senior Chief Clarke saving Captain Reeves. He waited while that sentence landed. Our backup system creates redundant copies every 60 seconds to an off-site server. He didn't know that existed. I have every frame. I also have audio of Dr. Hargrove on the phone at 2:04 a.m., instructing Senior Chief Clarke to provide only supportive care and refusing to send a physician to a patient in cardiac arrest. Marcus extended the flash drive further. This also includes footage of him in the security office attempting to erase the files. The hallway didn't just go quiet. The hallway went inverted, the kind of silence that happens when the ground shifts and everyone realizes they're standing on the wrong side of history. Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. There were liability concerns. The board will see this, Dr. Voss said, her voice the temperature of winter concrete. She was already on her phone with the state medical board. Within 90 minutes, Hargrove was advised by hospital counsel to retain private legal representation. Within 6 hours, his attempts to weaponize his network of golf buddies and board connections evaporated as those same people suddenly had no memory of knowing him. His carefully constructed hierarchy collapsed like a house built on ice. 6 months later, Oak Creek Memorial held its annual Veterans Day ceremony in the main atrium. Hannah stood in full navy dress blues, her decorations arranged in the proper sequence, smaller to larger, left to right, the medals catching light like captured stars. Her son Jake stood beside her in Marine Corps dress blues, and Captain Reeves stood beside him, both men rigid at attention. The hospital president read a commendation that made Hannah the director of critical care training, tasked with teaching combat trauma protocols to civilian staff, a position that hadn't existed before her. In the back of the atrium, Marcus Webb stood with arms crossed, grinning like a man who'd witnessed justice executed with surgical precision. Dr. Hargrove was not present. He'd been terminated following the medical board investigation. His license was restricted to non-clinical teaching only. He now taught CPR certification courses at Raleigh Community College for minimum wage, his career and reputation systematized into irrelevance. The applause that filled the atrium sounded like recognition finally arriving on time. Captain Reeves stepped forward and saluted her, a full military salute, the kind that subordinates only give to those they respect beyond the requirement of rank. Jake did the same. Hannah returned the salute, her spine straight, her composure absolute, tears in her eyes but her hand steady. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. And Hannah Clarke, Senior Chief Petty Officer, walked back into the ICU where 12 doctors had once abandoned a patient, where she had stayed, as she always stayed, carrying the weight that other people set down. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more tales of quiet heroism and unexpected valor. Like this video, comment below with your own story of standing firm when it would have been easier to walk away, and share this with someone who needs to know they're not as invisible as they think they are.